Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arlett. This week, things were looking up for Ukraine diplomatically, and its relationships seem to have drastically improved with the United States. Friday's meeting between Trump and Zelensky in the White House looks certain to produce long-range Tomahawk missiles for Kyiv to strike targets deep inside Russia, potentially expediting the Ukrainian sanctions on Russian oil and causing a nightmare for the Kremlin. However, Vladimir Putin once again went on a charm offensive, preempting Zelensky's Friday meeting at the White House, calling President Trump and having a 2.5-hour phone call with the U.S. president. The two presidents agreed to meet in Budapest in the upcoming weeks. Now it looks like this strategy may have brought the Kremlin more time to wage its indiscriminate campaign of conquest. And as we record this episode, the meeting with Trump and Zelensky is just about to get underway. So at this point, we still don't know the outcome. We will discuss the current situation with our guests, but first, let's take a look at this report straight out of Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky flew to Washington for a crunch meeting on Friday as his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump tried to harness the success of his Middle East ceasefire and to end the war in Ukraine.
Marco Rubio is going to be meeting with his counterpart, as you know, Lavrov, and they'll be meeting pretty soon. They're going to set up a time and a place very shortly.
But Vladimir Putin preempted the meeting, calling Trump on Tuesday in a 2.5-hour phone call. The two presidents agreed to another summit, this time in Budapest. The surprise move came after Trump announced the possibility of sending long-range Tomahawk missiles to Kyiv and mulling sanctions on China for buying Russian oil. Earlier, the U.S. president said India would stop buying Russian oil following a call with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius on Wednesday announced at the Ukraine Contact Group that Berlin is preparing a military aid package to Kyiv worth €2 billion. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told the meeting that Washington and its allies would take necessary steps to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression if the war in Ukraine does not end. Russia has continued to pound Ukraine's energy infrastructure, aiming to sap resolve by crippling power and gas facilities ahead of the cold winter months. Monday's deadly attacks claimed at least 6 lives and injured 9 others, and forced authorities to introduce emergency power outages in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Missile and drone attacks claimed a further 6 lives on Tuesday, with strikes in 8 locations hitting the Sumy region for a consecutive night. There was also strong condemnation for a Russian attack on a UN convoy delivering food aid in the Kherson region. Authorities on Wednesday said that Russian strikes killed 5 civilians, wounded at least 20 others, and caused widespread blackouts. Officials on Thursday reported a massive overnight strike on Ukrainian gas infrastructure. Moscow's forces launched more than 300 drones and 37 missiles, killing 2 and injuring 20 others. Ukraine has wrought more destruction on Russia's energy facilities, with video emerging on Monday of another drone attack in the Feodosia oil depot in occupied Crimea. According to the pro-Ukrainian Telegram channel Crimean Wind, 11 storage tanks were damaged, 10 of which were filled with fuel. A week earlier, an attack left a fire raging at the same facility for more than 4 days. The Institute for the Study of War identified continued pushes by Russian forces in the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the northeastern Kharkiv region. Mass evacuations have been carried out by the White Angels police unit, with the Kharkiv governor on Tuesday reporting 400 families were moved to safety, amounting to a total of 601 children. Further mandatory evacuations were also ordered around Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region on Thursday. They also continued in Donetsk and Sumy and other areas near the front. And now joining us here on Ukraine This Week to discuss the latest political developments of the week is Miroslava Gongadze, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yes. Now, based on this week's developments, what we're seeing, and of course, I remind our viewers that the meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky is yet to take place. We're waiting on that to happen anytime. This is a pre-record. But do you think that Donald Trump ever really seriously had the intention of giving Ukraine Tomahawks, or do you think maybe this was used as more of a threat to get Vladimir Putin to the table?
I believe that President Trump actually used Tomahawk missile as a stick for Russians, as a carrot for Ukrainians. It's a card that he plays well, and he is trying to push Russia to stop this aggression. However, promising something to Ukraine and threatening Russia that threatening Ukraine that Ukraine can actually hit the Russian target, and Ukraine can hit the Russian target. However, they do need much more support. So at this moment, I believe that's a negotiation tool to put Russia at the negotiation table.
Were you surprised at Thursday's news that Vladimir Putin called Donald Trump, spoke to him for 2.5 hours, and then, of course, they agreed to a meeting in Budapest?
It was a little bit surprising, and I would have to say that Ukrainian delegation who headed to Washington did not know about this possible phone call and this discussion that took place. So they were coming to Washington hoping that they would actually have a particular agreement on the Tomahawk missiles. And we will see what would happen at the White House. The Ukrainian delegation as well asked for Oval Office meeting and a joint press conference. That would not happen as well. It looks like the White House settled on the working lunch meeting for 2 hours, supposed to take place. And after the meeting, both presidents supposed to give a press conference or speak to the press separately. So it looks like that the phone call and the plan to meet President Putin was the surprise for many. However, it's not a surprise for analysts, because it looks like President Trump is trying to play on his successes in the Middle East and try to push the second kind of possible peace negotiation or peace agreement with Russia and Ukraine. We know that President Trump gave a lot of promises during his campaign and after his campaign that he would end this war. And we remember that he wanted to end this war in a day. It didn't happen. He switched his position a couple of times. And that's, I would see, is one of kind of next or another step of pushing Russia to put them at the negotiation table.
Right. Now, with this upcoming potential meeting in Budapest between Trump and Putin, just a few weeks off, it could be within the next maybe week or two, what do you think this means for Ukraine in the meantime? Does anything really seriously change, or will Ukraine continue to follow the path that it's been doing, these very successful strikes on knocking out Russian oil and refining capacity?
From what we see in the last 3 years, the only point to push Russia to stop this war is Ukraine's struggle, Ukraine resilience, and Ukraine ability to actually hit Russian targets. And only that would actually work for Russia. Russia does not right now. They're just trying to avoid another possible Ukrainian success, and specifically that probably was the goal for Putin to talk to President Trump this time around. But the only Ukrainian resolve and only European resolve to support Ukraine would actually work toward peace. Nothing else. From many analysts' perspective and from many politicians' perspective, especially from Ukrainian side, will work in this regard. Russia has to to suffer a serious defeat to actually being able to be open to any negotiation. And specifically, we have to talk about Europe here. Europe has to understand or realize finally that this is their war as well, and it's changed the narrative about helping Ukraine. The narrative should be helping ourselves, helping Europeans to actually survive and save their union, because what we see in the last months or last couple of weeks, Russia is testing European Union from every side possible, and testing how they will react to any escalation on Russian part. And European Union and NATO has to be resolved in their defense of their union.
They need to be, which makes this so depressing, watching the developments on Thursday and this, meeting coming with Vladimir Putin out of nowhere. Finally, we thought we were potentially going to turn the corner. We've seen these very successful drone strikes on, of course, the Russian oil, the refineries. In combination with Tomahawks, this would be a huge threat to Vladimir Putin. Do you think that, A, that's why he called and tried to kind of interject himself in these before this important meeting with Zelensky, number one? And I guess number two, well, let's start with that first.
Absolutely, that's what I said. I think that you remember 2 years ago when there was discussion about giving Ukraine F-16s and other more advanced weapons. And what was Russian tactics? Threatened Ukraine and threatened Europe of escalation, even using tactical nuclear missiles. So this is the same scenario, same tactics. They are trying to threaten and trying to kind of steal the possibility of Ukrainian winning. When is the moment when Ukraine is striving, Russia is trying to kind of steal that moment, and that's one of the moments.
Final question here before we go. There's been a lot of jokes online that Vladimir Putin will have to crawl through the Druzhba pipeline to get to Hungary for this meeting. How do you think it's going to take place with European Union airspace banned from Russian government aircraft and what have you? Do you think that countries like Poland are going to allow Vladimir Putin to fly through its airspace?
I mean, we don't know what Poland would do. However, we remember the negotiation or possible peace summit is in Switzerland, and the Swiss government back then said that they would allow Putin to come onto the Swiss land or Swiss airspace. So I think there would be some kind of type of negotiation, probably from even pushed from the White House, that would allow Putin to come. However, again, this would be a blow to European Union stand on their ban, and then European Union has to be not reactive but very proactive. So in the next 2 weeks, can actually make a lot of difference in the future of security in Europe.
Absolutely, indeed it will. Miroslava Gongadze, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week and sharing your thoughts. Thank you. And our next guest is Kateryna Stepanenko, Russia Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. Hello, Kateryna. Great to see you, and thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week.
Thank you for having me today.
Yes, now just recently, the Institute for the Study of War wrote that the Kremlin is preparing to mobilize reservists on a rolling basis to fight in Ukraine for the first time. What will this process look like, and what types of problems is Russia having with its manpower?
Yeah, the Kremlin's recruitment campaign, which was largely reliant on steep financial incentives to Russian citizens to lure them into service, is slowing down. The Russians are unable to generate nearly the necessary manpower to actually rotate personnel and break through the lines. So what the Kremlin is setting up now is a new system that will allow Russia to gradually and voluntarily call up so-called active reservists into military service in Ukraine and also abroad, without ever having to declare mobilization or formally declare war, allowing the Kremlin essentially to not upset the broader Russian society, as well as to preserve Russian regime stability. Now, the Kremlin claims that this will only impact the so-called active reserve or active reservists. Those are individuals who sign on a voluntary basis a contract with the Ministry of Defense to be part of the Russian so-called reserve. Russia has a larger involuntary reserve as well, where it's all of the men that have a military registration that would be subject to general mobilization. It seems like the new law is not impacting the involuntary mobilization reserve. However, it is still a really important development, especially if Russia decides to do some sort of covert operations in Europe, as it will not actually need to declare mobilization or declare war to mobilize some of individuals from its so-called active reserve. Now, I will also add to this assessment that it seems like the Kremlin remains committed to not doing a large-scale involuntary reservist call-up. There's some limitations on what Russia can do with its mobilization system, and there are economic, regime stability, and training implications that Russia cannot overcome. Hence why we're seeing this very covert and under the table sort of mobilization that is going on. But it's certainly a necessary and an important development in the Russian recruitment campaign.
Also North Koreans, what's the current situation, the contributions to the war effort in terms of manpower and weapons?
North Koreans have finally returned to front lines in Kursk Oblast. They were absent for some time after the Russian counterattack in Kursk Oblast to repel Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast that started in August of 2024 and continued through spring of 2025. During that time, North Koreans primarily operated in assault units and suffered significant losses because of the disorganization that happened on the front lines. Currently, the new cohort of North Koreans are involved in mostly supporting roles. So they are performing artillery tasks and also performing some drone support for Russian forces who are fighting in Sumy Oblast. We have not seen indications that North Koreans are crossing into Ukraine at this time, and mostly operating from mainland Russia. It is interesting that the Russians are finding ways to incorporate North Koreans more effectively into their campaign design. In the past, like I mentioned, North Koreans suffered significant losses because they were improperly integrated into assault units. However, now it seems that the Russians are able to limit the amount of communication necessary between Russian forces and North Korean forces, obviously for the language barrier, and use them in a more effective way as supporting elements.
Now, kind of changing the subject somewhat, assuming that Ukraine would receive Tomahawks from the United States, there was speculation that they would only get a small quantity of them. Now, of course, because it's before the meeting with Trump and Zelensky, we don't quite know at this exact time. But let's assume that Ukraine gets 20 to 50 Tomahawks. You, as an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, what would Ukraine's top targets be? What would be the most effective employment of those missiles?
Of course. The Ukrainians do need a lot of missiles to go after a variety of different targets that exist within the range that Tomahawks cover. However, there are two main targets that it would be essential for Ukrainian forces to strike. The first one is the Alabuga Special Economic Zone, which is located in Republic of Tatarstan. That's where Russia produces most of its Shahed drones that have been instrumental in Russian efforts to destroy Ukrainian energy grid, as well as the recent efforts to use Shaheds against targets in Ukrainian near rear, as well as along the front lines. So destroying that and destroying Russia's capability of producing 2,000 Shaheds per month is a notable and very important target for Ukrainian forces. The other target, of course, is the Engels airfield, which is also within range. That is where Russia has its strategic bombers that Russia uses to conduct its nearly daily strikes on Ukraine. Specifically, it's a missile and drone campaign that it launches against Ukrainian civilians, as well as Ukrainian energy infrastructure ahead of winter.
Now, concerning the Ukrainian sanctions, quote unquote sanctions on Russian oil, how successful has this operation been? And if it continues at this rate, when will Russia reach a critical situation both for the economy and its war machine?
Yeah, Ukrainians have been launching a very deliberate and coordinated campaign against Russian oil infrastructure, namely Russian oil refineries. These are really good targets because they are essentially very flammable. You don't need a lot of payload to set them on fire. And one of the biggest challenges with any drone campaign is that drones have a lot smaller payload than your traditional missile. So far, it seems that Ukrainian forces have been able to accomplish some gas shortages across Russia and occupied Ukraine that is causing a lot of problems for not only civilian functions, but also some of the military functions as well. In terms of the economy, I think it will take a long time and a lot more effort to actually impose significant challenges on Russian economy in the long term. One of the biggest things that is probably the most successful and the most effective economic sanction on Russian forces and Russian society is Ukrainian military operations. Ukraine must be able to be empowered to actually do counterattacks and counteroffensives on the battlefield, as that actually takes significant resources from the Russian society. It takes manpower from the manpower that otherwise could have been used in various different industrial sectors of Russia. It also takes a significant toll on the Russian budget and stops Russian forces, Russian people from having higher spending on domestic things and committing Russian society to more military spending. This is all to say that it is important to empower Ukrainian forces to continue their military operations and actually restore maneuver on the battlefield, as the losses that Russia is sustaining continue to decrease due to the current nature of the front line, and is taking a lesser toll on the Russian society that backs that military support.
Now, when talking about these strikes, these long-range strikes, Ukrainian strikes using drones and what have you, has there been any major confirmation of the use of these flamingos, and how widespread have they been used thus far?
There were some speculations that Ukrainians either tested or used them, but I'm not entirely sure on the top of my head. Of course, the Ukrainian ability to develop their own missiles is very important because of the issue of payload. Like I mentioned, the drones, they have a smaller payload and therefore cannot take out decisively some of the infrastructure targets that Ukraine needs to take out in an effort to actually achieve operational effects on the battlefield. For example, destroying an oil refinery with a drone is a lot more doable than would be to destroy a larger factory facility, for example, like the Alabuga Special Economic Zone and drone factory.
Right, now moving on to the front lines, Russians have rapidly advanced towards the center of the city of Kupiansk, especially in the past couple of days, but in the past month itself as well. Now they control half of the city. So what is the latest assessment on this part of the front line?
Russian forces have been using gradual infiltration tactics to go and advance into central part of Kupiansk. However, their control over Kupiansk is widely disputed, largely because the infiltration tactics, They're usually done by one or two servicemen that try to advance through urban infrastructure, specifically pipelines, in an effort to bypass Ukrainian lines and enter essentially from into the Ukrainian rear. So the situation in Kupiansk is very interesting. It's still developing, but Russian forces are clearly trying to have a large Pyrrhic victory. We see this from the commentary that we received from the Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov, as well as Putin. It seems that Russians really want to have some sort of victory over a town in eastern Ukraine, especially given that they have not been able to achieve their goal of seizing Pokrovsk, which the campaign for which they started over a year ago.
Kateryna Stepanenko from the Institute for the Study of War, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciate you coming on the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching and hope to see you then. Goodbye.